Hi, Honors Freshman English. Sorry I couldn't be with you today. I'm actually at a conference called McCall, which is for technology and education. So I thought I'd use technology for today to create a screencast for you. We're going to work together to complete the work for today, and hopefully you'll learn a bit. So the first thing I'd like you to do, the other day I gave you a sheet, what is poetry? And I asked you 3 questions on that. I'd like you to have that out. On Wednesday, you were able to talk to some classmates about your thoughts on poetry. Yesterday, we did an activity on poetry, and my idea for you today is to use what you learned from that activity to add to your notes about poetry. So I have a few questions for you to consider. You do not have to answer all of them, they're just to get you thinking. First, how does each station from yesterday expand your view of poetry? That is, why would I have you do each station? Just think, I didn't have you do those stations randomly. Each one had a very specific purpose. Each one had you working in a very specific way with language. What were those ways? Why did those matter? Second, take a look at your answers to the questions that I asked you on Tuesday night, right? Those are the questions on the first side of this page. How does the activity that we did yesterday complicate or change your answers? How might it make your answers more complex? And then last, what did you learn from the activity that we did? You're going to write down your notes on the note side of the What is Poetry sheet. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do this, so just pause the video, write down your ideas, and when you're ready, start the video back up. All right. Let's continue. I do want to talk about what you added to your note section of the poetry sheet, but we'll talk about that on Monday because I'm curious to see what you guys have to say. For now, let's start with analyzing poetry. I want to give you an easy and concrete way to do this, to dig really deep into text, but to do it in a structured way so it's not too intimidating for you. You should have 2 pages on your desk that you just received today. The first one looks like this. On the front side, there's a poem called Unfolding Bud by Naoshi Koriyama. On the other side, there's a poem by Lucille Clifton called Miss Rosie. Right now, we're going to focus on Unfolding Bud, but I don't even want you to read it yet. Instead, I want you to look at the other page on your desk. The page should look like this. We're going to do this together, and by the end of the class hour, I hope that you feel pretty comfortable using this method. Keep in mind that you can always ask me questions on Monday. The most important part is that you try and that you put some effort into this. If you struggle, if you feel challenged, that's totally fine. In fact, that's a good thing. So, first I want you to write down your name and the date. I'm going to switch over to my other view of this sheet, which I have completed already, and I'm going to reveal to you as we go on here. So I filled in my name, Miss Peck, March 20th, 2015, and then the title of the poem, The Unfolding Bud. Make sure that the title is in quotation marks. Any poem title will be in quotation marks, not underlined and not italicized. Alright, so the first thing we have to look at with any poem, and the first thing we have to consider is the title. The question I ask you is this: what do you think the poem might be about based on the title? Write incomplete sentences. So in poetry, in my opinion, titles are really, really, really important. Think about the title of the one-word poem yesterday. Essentially, that title made that one word a poem. Think about it. Because the poet says it is a poem, maybe it is. Okay, so maybe you disagree. Regardless, titles are really, really, really important. So I want you to take a moment. Pause the video, write down at least one sentence. Based on this title, Unfolding Bud, what do you think the poem is going to be about? Alright, let's take a look at my answer. Let me highlight this. Oops, I need to switch over to my other view. Okay, so I'm going to make this black so you can see it. Here's my thought. I think the poem will probably be about a blooming flower. Besides that, I'm not sure. Your answer was probably somewhat like this. That's okay. It's just a prediction. Alright, so now we have to read the poem. Let me read it to you because I always think that poetry should be read out loud. Go ahead and take a look at the poem. Unfolding Bud by Naoshi Koriyama. One is amazed by a water lily bud, unfolding with each passing day, taking on a richer color and new dimensions. One is not amazed at first glance by a poem, which is as tight-closed as a tiny bud. Yet, one is surprised to see the poem gradually unfolding, revealing its rich inner self as one reads it again and over again. Alright, so let's go back to your TPCAPSTT worksheet. The next step in TPCAPSTT is paraphrasing. You probably know what paraphrasing is. Essentially, it's putting it into your own words. But before we even do that, we need to first define any vocabulary words from the poem that might give you trouble. List the words and their definitions below. I want you to really look at this poem. Are there any words that, if I asked you to define it out loud for the class right now, you wouldn't really have a good definition for? I bet there is at least one. Pause the video. Take a moment. I want you to write down that word and then, using your phone or using a dictionary in the back of the room, write down a reasonable definition for that word. Alright, let's continue. For me, that word was dimensions. It's like I kind of felt like I knew what that meant, but maybe not really. So if we look at Google, dimensions definition. Let's look at the first definition. Does it fit? An aspect or feature of a situation, problem, or thing. In context, yes, that definitely works. Then 2, a measurable extent of some kind, such as length, breadth, depth, or height. That works too, because 1, a flower can show us different aspects or features, but it can also actually grow, right? It could grow in breadth, it could grow in depth, height, and length. So both of those definitely make sense. Okay. The next step here, and you can see what I have done. I will make this darker. So make sure you have this written down. I wrote down both definitions. Next, the more familiar part of paraphrase for you will be rewrite the poem in your own words. Use complete sentences. Alright, let's take a look at the poem again. Depending on how hard the language is in a poem, I'm going to paraphrase in different ways. Let's say this is Shakespeare. Shakespeare can be very challenging to get through. I would probably paraphrase it line by line and break it down really specifically. This language, though, is a lot easier. I feel like I understand the poem, so I'm going to suggest that you do 1 sentence per stanza. Stanza are each one of these chunks. See, 1, 2, 3. There are 3 stanzas in this poem. I like to think of stanzas as the equivalent to paragraphs, but in poetry. So, on your TPCAP sheet, and I'll flip back to this, write down the number 1, 2, and 3. For each stanza, write down a 1-sentence summary. Just rewrite that stanza in your own words. Just use different words. Don't think too hard about it. Let me give you one example. So for the first stanza, here is what I wrote. I'm sorry this is taking a while. I'm obviously having some technical difficulties. Alright. Okay. So for stanza 1, I have a blooming water lily is amazing. It doesn't sound as good. It's not supposed to, but there's my rewrite. Pause it. Take a second, and I want you to put into your own words, one sentence each, stanza 2 and stanza 3. Go ahead. All right, let's continue. So I'll flip back to my TPCAP sheet, and I'm going to reveal what I have for the next 2 stanzas. This is what I said. Stanza 2, at first glance, a poem is not amazing. All right, doesn't sound as good, but that makes sense. And then stanza 3. However, it's surprising that a poem gradually unfolds and gets more meaningful over time, just like a flower. I thought it was important to add that simile in there, that comparison, because that's kind of the point of stanza 3. That's at least what I saw. So I put that simile in at the very end. Okay, let's move on to the next section of TPCAPS. You'll see at the bottom of your sheet a section called connotation, so I will read that to you. Connotation. Look closely at the words the poet chose to use, and that's diction, right? What emotional meaning do certain words carry? Explain the emotional impact of those words. I'm looking for words that stand out to me, words that seem important. So let's take a look at the poem. In reading the first line, one word that really jumps out to me is, oops, not all of that. I just mean amazed. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this, and I'll reveal this for you. So I wrote down the word amazed. I want you to write that down in the first box of your connotation section. You actually have to flip the page over. Now, I'm asking for 2 things, both the emotional impact and the importance. Let's start with the emotional impact. When you think connotation, you probably think positive or negative. The first thing you can write down in this box to the right of the word amazed is whether you think amazed has a positive or a negative connotation. So just go ahead and write that down. Alright, but as you know, just positive or negative is not quite enough. In addition to that, I want you to write down things that the word amazed makes you think of, right? Or feelings it makes you think. So here's what I think. So the emotional impact is yes, it's positive. But then I tell you what I think of when I think of the word amazed. I think of being in awe, inspired, of something incredible. So we are amazed by great and beautiful things in life, right? I'm telling you everything I think of when I think of the word amazed. Now that's kind of the easy part, you telling me what the word makes you think of, what the emotional impact of that word is. The harder part is determining the importance. The essential question is, why would the poet have used this word as opposed to any other word? I'll give you my answer to this. So I thought the importance was, it stresses the emotional connection we immediately feel to flowers and not necessarily to poems. We are just naturally amazed by flowers, right? We are in awe of them. We're inspired. We think they're incredible. We write poetry about flowers. We give flowers as gifts to people that we love, right? So, just think about that. I want you to choose 2 more words in this poem. Or rather, I'll give you the words that I want you to do. I'll give you a second after I've given you the words to write them down. You'll pause the video, and then I want you on the right hand side to do both the emotional impact and the importance of those words. So the first one I want you to do is rich. It's used twice in the poem, actually, or richer. Okay? And the second word I want you to use is surprised. Pause the video, and again, write down the emotional impact, right? Whether positive or negative, and then what it makes you think of. Then second, I want you to write the importance of those words. Let's continue. Let me show you what I wrote for both of these. First, under richer. I'll make this dark so you can see it. For emotional impact, I said rich or richer also has a really positive connotation. When I think rich, I think deep, I think complex. In fact, when I think rich, I know it's kind of funny, but I think chocolate, because chocolate has those qualities. But I also think about worth. So what's the importance? I said, the word shows that when time passes, a flower can get more beautiful and be worth more. It can become deeper and more interesting. And of course, as we see, a poem can become richer too. For surprised. Needless to say, I thought this was also a positive emotional impact, but that's not quite enough. I need to say more, right? We hope for surprises. Think of surprise birthday parties or the surprise reveal of whether a baby is a girl or a boy. And yet there's also an element of mystery inherent in surprise. Without that mystery, a surprise wouldn't be so special. We never see a true surprise coming. Think about that. So here's the importance. Using this word, it lets a poem take on a delightfully mysterious quality. So the poem becomes something that gives us joy when it's revealed. We're surprised by that poem. Next, we're going to talk about attitude. So attitude you can also think of as tone. But here's a question. So what is the poet's attitude towards the subject of the poem and then towards the reader? So this is really a two-parter. First, let's think. If we want to determine the poet's attitude towards the subject of the poem, we have to determine the subject of the poem. What is this poem about? Think about it for just a moment. What do you think? What's this poem about? For me, I think this poem is essentially about poetry. Consider, what does the poet think about poetry? How does the poet feel about poetry? What is the poet's attitude towards poetry? And I want you to write down your ideas. I'll have you start this way. I know this is a ridiculous question, but does the poet hate poetry? I think the obvious answer to that question is no. So if not, how does the poet feel? I want you to pause the video and write down your ideas. How does the poet feel about the subject of this poem, which I could argue is poetry itself? All right, here are my thoughts about the poet's attitude towards poetry. I'll make this darker so you can see it. I said the poet shows a sense of awe and reverence towards poetry. If he didn't care about poetry, if he didn't think it was beautiful, he wouldn't compare it to something as naturally gorgeous as a flower. Now for the part that I think is a little bit harder. You also have to answer this question towards the reader. Think about this, right? Essentially, the poet is addressing you as a reader. So what is the poet's attitude towards you? Let me start with another ridiculous question. Is the poet annoyed at you? All right, I think the obvious answer to that question is no. But if not, then what is the poet's attitude towards you? So the next thing you can write down is attitude towards the reader, and you can write it down just like this. Pause the video take a moment, and I want you to try this. It's easy to just let the video keep going, but I want you to attempt it. What do you think the attitude towards the reader, or you, is? You can always change it after you see my answer, but I want you to make an attempt. Alright, pause the video, go ahead. Okay, take a look at your answer. See how it matches up to mine. This is what I said. The poet seems as if he wants to deliver a lesson, and yet not in a pedantic way. Right? Sometimes people like to be kind of a know-it-all when they're teaching, right? But I definitely don't think the poet is trying to be a know-it-all here. Instead, here's what I said. The way the poem naturally unfolds over 3 stanzas gives me a sense of calm and zen. Something else that gives me a sense of calm is the fact that he talks about a water lily, right? And when I think about water, I think about calmness. The poet wants us to naturally reveal, or the poet wants to, I need to change that, naturally reveal the truth about poetry to us. It's not like he's hitting us over the head with the fact that he thinks this. Poems are like flowers. No, instead he lets us come to that conclusion on our own. Let's move on. The next thing we have to look at are patterns within the poem. So patterns can be anything that you notice happening again and over again. Here's my question. Did the poet use any purposeful patterns? Pattern could be repetition of a certain line, or a certain word, or a certain type of syntax or sentence structure, right? It could be something else, like alliteration. That's a repetition of consonant sounds. It can also be things like metaphors or similes. Any of those rhetorical devices that we learned earlier this year, those can be patterns too. And then next, what purpose do these patterns serve in the poem? The easy part is pointing out the patterns. Take a look at your poem. Oops. So, with your pencil or pen, I want you to annotate. Do you see any patterns? Underline or circle them. Pause the video, take a moment to do that. Alright. I wonder if you noticed the same patterns that I did. So, I'll go back to the worksheet. I'm just going to list 2. Perhaps there are more that you notice, but here are the ones that I noticed. And I bet a lot of you did the same ones. So, here's one. So the beginning of every stanza is pretty similar. Starts with one is or one is not, right? Here's another that I noticed. The word rich is actually used twice. Alright, so here's the hard part. I want you on the right-hand side to consider what the purpose might be. Just come up with a hypothesis. It's okay if you're wrong, but why do you think the poet would have done this? Why would the poet have used the repetition at the beginning of lines here? Why would the poet have used the word rich twice? Pause the video, take a guess, before you go on to see what I thought. Alright, let me reveal to you what I thought the purpose of these patterns was. So first, for the same beginning of each stanza, I said the stanzas start the same way for a reason. It makes me think that it is the same person in all 3 stanzas, right? That person whose quote-unquote name is one, yeah? This provides an inherent connection between the flower and the poem. That same person, that one, sees the same qualities in both, since it carries from stanza 1 to stanza 2 to stanza 3. Then for the word rich. This poem is so short. There is no way that the poet accidentally used the word rich twice. No way. Let's take a look. Why the same word? It's no accident. When I see rich twice, I am reminded that it is a quality shared definitively by the flower and the poem. The poet doesn't use synonyms. He could have used a different word, right? Instead of rich. He could have looked it up in the thesaurus, but he doesn't. He uses the exact same one. The words are the same intentionally, so we as readers make that connection. Let's move on to shifts. So these are really important in a poem. Shifts are just changes. So here are my questions. It can be changes of any kind, but I specifically asked about attitude. You might see some in attitude, but if you see a different kind of shift, that's okay too. Are there any shifts in attitude? Where do they occur? And how does the attitude change? I'm going to give you a hint. Many times, shifts are noted by a word like but, for, so, yet. Those connector words are often words that indicate a shift. I want you to take a moment and do you notice any shifts in this poem? Pause the video, write down what shifts you do see. Alright, so if we look back at the poem, I'll show you where I saw some shifts. You might have noticed one, you might have noticed two. I picked up on two. I think one is more important than the other, but let me show them to you. Okay, so the first shift I noticed if I can just get it to be the right color here, is from stanza 1 to stanza 2. Take a look at it. There is a shift in stanza 1, right? We are naturally so awed over a flower. To stanza 2, and this is how I described it, to a sense of nonchalance, like we just don't care about the poem. There's nothing special about that poem. Then I pointed out another shift. From stanza 2 to stanza 3. I noticed the word yet. That was definitely a shift, right? So I said after the word yet there is an epiphany, this realization, because that's what that means, that the flower and poem share the same qualities. This brings a newfound sense of awe to the poem, like we have just realized this awesome thing about poetry in the last stanza. Okay. Let's move on. We are moving back to title again. Yep, we're going to return to the title because hopefully after we've read it, we have some new understanding of it. Look at the title once more. How is it significant now that you have analyzed the poem as a whole? Pause the video and I want you to write down an answer for yourself in a complete sentence. Go ahead. Alright, so here is my answer. Sorry about that. Okay, I said the poem I am currently analyzing, the one that we are looking at on the screen, right? This one right here, is itself an unfolding bud. With close analysis, it gets richer and more beautiful. The poem I'm reading and the flower in the poem are alike. And I came to this realization. The title of the poem is much more significant to me now, and I think that's so cool. Lastly, This is the hardest part of TPCAPS, but it's also the most important. So after analyzing everything, we need to come to a conclusion. What's the theme of the message? What are we supposed to take away from this? In other words, what is the poet's overall message or idea for the reader within this poem? Remember our rules for themes, and we've worked a lot on themes this year. A theme should be universal. A theme should not be immoral, so try to avoid second person or first person. And a theme should be a complete thought or a sentence. Pause the video. I know it's hard, but I want you to write something down. What do you get from this poem? Go ahead. Here is what I put. It's totally possible that yours is going to be different, but here's my idea. I said, time and patience help people to see beauty in both nature and in ideas. So I try to be pretty universal, right? Nature, of course, is that flower. But the ideas is poetry that we come to at the end of the poem. I really like this poem. I think it's awesome, and I think it's a great introduction to poetry because it says a lot about poetry itself. Now that we have done this together, we will continue by doing another one on Monday with Miss Rosie.